Hello, ladies. So today, as I promised, we are going to be talking about traumas that wreck our lives. And the way we segued into this subject is we started with relationships and we started discussing that oftentimes we can't function normally and we're having all those problems, not even just in personal relationships, but even at work with our parents, with our friends. We're having conflicts, we're having fights, we feel like nobody is accepting us. We always find ourselves in situations that we don't like. Different types of life problems that come our way, and conversations seem to divert to the subject of why this is happening. And one of the reasons of why this is happening is because of traumas that we have experienced in our lives that are affecting our perception, how we react, what happens to us. This is a very very vast, very broad subject that we definitely not going to cover in just one video or even two or three or four. This is going to be a very long topic for those of you who are interested. So today we are going to start our discussion specifically on traumas. And obviously, in order to address something properly, we need to understand what it is that we are addressing, what it is that we're dealing with, kind of define you and know your enemy before you can be victorious over them. So let's start by defining trauma. I mean, it may sound silly. I mean, we know when we're traumatized, right? Or so we think. But as we are going to discuss today, it's very important to define it correctly and understand the essence of it, because unless we don't, then our efforts are not going to be as effective as they should be. So how would you define trauma? Any thoughts?
Well, it hurts.
All right, so that is definitely one thing that we associate with trauma, but that's not necessarily what trauma is. Let's just go a little bit deeper. Give me more. Ima?
For me, I think trauma is something that keeps you from functioning normally. So, for example, people can get very depressed as a result of trauma.
Yeah, or have other serious problems. So I'd say for an example, so I've heard of the bulimia, as in serious overeating is sometimes a result of emotional trauma.
Much warmer. So, okay, now we're getting a little bit deeper into trying to describe what trauma is. Very good observations, by the way. Thank you. Definitely things that trauma causes or are associated with trauma, but that still doesn't tell me what trauma is. Those are attributes of how we can describe it, of what we experience in association with, but it still doesn't give me a definition of what specifically is trauma. So how about another stab at it?
Okay. I would define trauma as a painful experience. It can make you cry, overeat, so on. I was also thinking of insomnia. I've heard a lot of times people, they have trouble sleeping due to emotional trauma from their past.
Okay, so definitely warmer. So let's look further at our presentation here. So let's take trauma. We're trying to define trauma. And what I hear you guys saying is it hurts. So another thing that people say, hey, it makes you overeat, like Stacy brought up bulimia, so that it causes causes you to do things that you wouldn't normally do. It makes you lose sleep. It all does, it does all those unpleasant things. Another thing that I've just heard you guys describe it, it's a painful experience, which I think Stacy came very close by defining trauma as, we in general non-professional world would define it as, hey, trauma is something that hurts. But let me give you an example of a very painful experience. And it was so painful, I still remember it, even though it happened in high school or maybe early college. So, definitely over 10 years ago for me. And so there was those particular brand designer shoes that I really wanted. And I went into Nordstrom Rack, and if you guys live elsewhere and you don't have Nordstrom Rack, it's a liquidator for Nordstrom. It's like all the expensive designer shoes sometimes go on sale, and they sell them for a lot less than they usually are. And so I went into Nordstrom Rack, and lo and behold, those shoes are on sale there, and they're discounted from $230 15 years ago. That's a lot of money. $230 to $30. And those are the shoes I've been dreaming about for I don't know how long. So I reach in my purse and I left my card at home. So obviously by the time I came back, the shoes were gone because we're talking a liquidator. So that was a very painful experience. It hurt. And I should say it made me lose sleep, and it made me go get myself a huge milkshake and down it right there because I felt like a total loser, and sugar and milkshake overeating was a fair cure. So now I've just described all the symptoms and attributes we ascribe to trauma. So would you say I've experienced trauma at that point?
Oh, wow. Yeah. I mean, trauma with long-lasting results, definitely traumatized for life. No, I'm just kidding, of
Still
course.
remember.
I mean, we should know, ladies, who we are talking to here. Helena always has a trick behind her back when she asks us questions. But now even I am confused. So it's not correct to define trauma as a painful experience, or does it depend how painful? Is this what you're getting at?
Not really. Let's look further. How do I move this? My PowerPoint's sticking, unfortunately. Oh, my PowerPoint's sticking and I cannot advance my slide, which sucks. So what are we gonna do? I don't know. I guess I have to stop sharing my screen. Move my slide manually. And then start sharing the screen again. Okay, there we go. Okay, let me know when you guys can see my screen. There we go. Okay, so what I was going to talk about here is, as you can see, I've expanded it, and let's talk about gallbladder attack. So like Laura says, okay, so is it only trauma when it hurts a lot? So let's think about a gallbladder attack. It hurts a lot, obviously a lot more than shoes ever would. You end up in the hospital with it. obviously, maybe even some dietary, changes and lack of sleep would be associated with that. But I don't think we can say that after experiencing a gallbladder attack that is properly treated and taken care of medically, we can't say we're traumatized. And now I'm talking about in a physical sense. So that should be a hint for you guys. I'm moving it into the physical realm of things. And as we've discussed before, emotional trauma and physical trauma follow the same parallels. So if it's a really painful experience physically, we still can't call it trauma. Same thing would apply emotionally. It could hurt a lot, and it still is not trauma. So I'm going to give you one last chance. Take one more last stab at it, and then I'll explain it. Laura, why don't I have you try it again?
Yeah, sure. Let me try. Now, I would say trauma is like a scar. It's something that doesn't go away and you have to live with it. Like, for example, if you have had a cut, you will then have a scar on your face, which means you would look a bit different. So after an emotional trauma, you would have these scars, which will make you different. So after for example, like the girl that we've talked about, we don't know if she was raped or not, right? But she is acting differently because of some emotional scars. So she's like depressed and sociable and so on.
Right. So I'm going to, I've pulled up this slide because I'm going to explain what uh, how you evaluate that. Before I jump into that, I want to backtrack into what Laura is talking about in terms of the girl who was raped or maybe wasn't raped. It's something that we've talked about in our previous video. And so there was a discussion of whether it happened or not, but what we're observing is that she's depressed. She doesn't leave her room. She's just being different. And so this is what Laura is referring to, is that we don't know what happened, but we know something happened because she is acting different. And so Laura is describing trauma as a scar. That's something that is visibly different, even though we don't know how painful or how significant the experience was. So definitely warmer. But what I'm driving at here, you guys, is that if we take Red Bull that I pulled up here on the screen, we can describe it in very different ways. We can say it tastes like pop. We can say it's reminiscent of apple juice, except it's carbonated, so on and so forth. But all those are descriptions, and that's what we've been hearing here, are different descriptions, different attributes of trauma. But what is a Red Bull? It may be like pop, it may taste like carbonated, it may taste like apple, it may taste like, anything you want to compare it. But in essence, it is an energy drink that's designed to give you wings as an energy in order to accomplish things that you want to accomplish throughout the day. So there is a difference between what it is like and what it is. So let's define trauma for what it is, not for what it's like, because that's what we've been defining it so far. It's like, it hurts. It's like a painful experience. It's like a scar. It's all those likes that we're seeing at the top of, the top arrow here. But what is it? And so let's go back to the physical analogy that I have already tried to hint around with gallbladder, which is a physical experience, but we couldn't call it trauma, even though it was a painful experience. So let's define emotional trauma along the lines of physical trauma. So, Stacy, if you were to define a physical trauma, let's talk about physical. Let's say you have a broken leg, you have a paper cut. If you were to define that condition of physical trauma without using the word trauma, what would you say?
Okay, let me see. If I were to define a broken leg, you know, paper cut, things like that, I would say it's a form of damage to your body.
Exactly. So that is very important. And this is the takeaway that I want you guys to walk away with from this video. And I'll explain to you why this is so important and why I have spent so much time getting to that point. So I have just replaced the first slide that said traumas that wreck our lives to a form of damage that wrecks our lives. Why is this important? Because we've just spent 15-20 minutes trying to define trauma, and we really couldn't get to the point unless, you know, we've put all this serious effort, because in our everyday life, we tend to equate trauma with pain, which, you know, trauma does have pain, but you can't put an equal sign between trauma and pain, because something can be very painful, like a gallbladder attack in a physical sense, or missing on the shoes you wanted for a long time, or whatever it may be. And still you wouldn't be traumatized. Even going back to Laura's example, so trauma's like a scar. Okay, scar is a physical damage, but not every paper cut would leave a scar. Sometimes it may heal up without the remaining damage. And so when we talk about trauma, what is important for you guys to remember is that it is a form of damage. Regardless of how painful the experience may have been, if it didn't leave damage, then you don't have trauma. It was just a painful experience. Again, taking along the physical experiences, you know, you poked yourself, it was very painful, you screamed, and then it healed and nothing left. And from the physical standpoint, you don't see a scar, you don't see anything left over there. It didn't leave damage. Same thing emotionally. Something could have been very painful, but if it didn't cause any damage, then it's not trauma. Therefore, and why again it's important to remember, because those lines are blurred, and oftentimes we tend to focus on the pain and the hurts and the attributes, and immediately we assume it's trauma. For example, I had a very painful experience in my childhood. Yes, does it necessarily mean I'm traumatized? No. If that damage didn't occur, then it was just a painful experience. So that's why we spend so much time. I wanted to illustrate you guys is that right off the bat, from our natural perception, that is not obvious to us. But once we get to the point, this is something that I want you to remember from this video on as we go through, is trauma is a form of damage, because that is going to be very important. But so now that we've established that trauma is a form of damage, what is the damage done to? It's a form of damage to what? Laura, can you help me out here?
Actually, I don't know, to be honest. What do you have in mind?
Yeah, that is definitely a trick question. Difficult question. So let me go through this briefly. We are going to dig a lot deeper into subsequent videos. But for the purposes of today, just kind of high level view of what we even are going to cover in the series. So trauma is a form of damage. I want to emphasize it again. I'm having this illustration because that is our main takeaway. But the damage to what? The trauma is defined as damage to our true self. So what is true self is a topic for a separate discussion that we're going to dig deeper as we go along. But you can, for now, you can fall back on your just general perception, understanding of self, of who you are, who you were born, your thoughts, your ideas of your perception of the world, your contribution to the world. True self is who you are. However, that gets a little tricky because true self is who you are, who you were born, the essence that constitutes a real you. But we develop an ego, and ego tends to, meanings of the words and descriptions change. And just like we said, we tend to associate trauma with pain without really understanding that trauma, in fact, isn't pain. Trauma is damage, if we were to define it. Once we got to that, yeah, no brainer. But before we did, our general perception is to associate it with pain or other attributes. Same thing with ego. We tend to associate it with attributes which don't always define the essence. And so we know of inflated ego of, somebody who is into himself, especially when we talk about personality X, and it comes along the parallels of narcissism, then, especially there it comes to, big egoism, ego. So that, puffed up, part of self, which it's as relevant to ego as pain to trauma. It connected, has to do, but definitely not an equal sign. So ego is a self that we develop in order to present to the world that may or may not match our true self. To kind of give you a quick example, for example, an inquisitive child, if you ever had a 2-year-old around, they're going to dig through all the drawers, they're going to get everywhere, they, exploring, they are very inquisitive. So now you take this child to the bank, and they're being themselves, they're being very inquisitive, they want to explore, but now you have to tell them is that you can't go dig in the bank teller drawers because that's not appropriate. So in an ideal world for a person who is mature, I would say, hey, I'm still an inquisitive person, but the boss of my inquisitive personality here, so I'm going to hold it back from the drawers, and I'm going to explore something else. For an adult, I may still be same inquisitive person. I'm standing in the bank line, and I'd be looking outside and wondering about the leaves, or I am looking at something on my phone. So I still have a channel for my inquisitiveness. I am just not channeling it to a particular place where it wouldn't be appropriate. But in our imperfect world, what it often tells the child is that inquisitiveness is bad. No, don't do it. You cannot be yourself. You cannot be an inquisitive person. And they don't realize that it's only in this particular setting and application that really shouldn't limit them as being that particular person. And it translates into that I have to present another person to the world, because if I'm not inquisitive, then they're going to like me better. I'm a well-behaved child. I don't get into anything. And so inquisitiveness is bad, but strict guidelines is good. And so that becomes my ego. And I begin to believe that this is the right thing for me to do, because that's what gets a better response. Again, it can get very technical, and it's hard to explain in just a few words, but we're going obviously be talking a lot more about this in subsequent videos. So what I want you to walk away with is true self, what you truly are. Ego is a set of which I'm going to tell you on the next slide, a set of what oftentimes, but I'm trying to come up with a better word for when it's not dysfunctional. I guess, a set of behaviors that we develop in order to be more presentable. And a lot of times we take them over of what we truly feel and what we truly want, and they become our ego. So when it comes to traumas, especially, and what we're going to be talking about a lot, those are called masks. So they cover up of who we are and present to the world something else. When we're talking about trauma, a lot of those are used for protection. We're trying to preserve what's on there, and it also presents to the world an image that they want to see, which again, for trauma, this is what it is, and it's a certain set of behaviors that we develop for those purposes, and become to believe that those behaviors are us. So we destroy our true self, and we think that this mask or this presentation that we've developed is indeed who we are. Another example that I can give you to illustrate this, I see that a lot, people split up, the guy leaves, the girl is left with the child, the girl raises the child by herself, the father is nowhere around for the first year or two, and then he gets hit with child support. And as soon as he gets hit with child support, all of a sudden he starts showing interest in the child. Not because he feels he wants to, obviously, that wasn't the need for the previous 2 years, but because he thinks that that's what he needs to do, because that's appropriate under the circumstances. If you're going to pay for it, you may as well participate in their life. So that's a form of ego, to where it's not what the person truly feels, but that's what they feel they need to present, even for their own sake, for nobody else, but they think that's who they are, which indeed in reality is not. So what a mask does is, that's a very good illustration that I wanted to show you. It hides what you think is ugly, which, not necessarily the case, because we all were created a beautiful human being. So our true self is probably the most beautiful thing that there is. It's unique. You were put here for a purpose. You were made who you are, because that's the ultimate contribution to the world that you can make. And if you know who you are, if you nurture it, again, it's the most beautiful thing that there is. But if there are scars, if there is destruction, if there is there are other things going on, then we're not in touch of it, and it, we may feel it's ugly because it hurts, and then presents a certain expectation to the world, or rather a way to meet their expectation by showing them a pretty mask. So when it comes to trauma, what we're going to be talking about, there are different types of trauma, and I'm not going to get into them into any depth, but to give you an example, for example, if a person gets rejected, then the mask that they're going to wear is withdrawal. Kind of even give you a very surface brief example. If somebody doesn't want you around and says, hey, we have no interest in you, your first reaction is like, I'll leave. I'm not gonna bother you guys, whatever. Withdrawal is the normal reaction. But if we put it as a mask, as I'm an aloof person, I have no interest, and I don't have any interest getting close with anybody. I don't get close with people. I try to stay away. I try to be a hermit. That would be a mask of withdrawal, which in this case is triggered by the trauma of rejection, which is not necessarily you. So when we go into our next video, in fact, I'm going to spend the entire video talking specifically about that so that you guys can kind of understand a little bit more of dynamics of what happens here. So again, if you were abandoned, then and for fear of losing that, help support, the mask would be dependence. Humiliation tends to develop the mask of self-deprecation. So if somebody puts you down, you become to believe it, then your self-esteem is zero, and you always think you're not worthy, you don't deserve anything, you can't, your opinion doesn't count, so you're not even gonna express it. Betrayal, again, from trying to avoid the hurt of this happening again, makes control freaks. Person tries to control everything and everybody in subconscious effort to prevent such an unexpected event of betrayal happening. If you got it under control, then you can keep, from something like that happening, and what's going to happen. You're not going to all of a sudden come to a chaos like this. And injustice causes rigidity. Again, those are the traumas that we're going to cover in more detail as we go along. But what I want to illustrate to you guys is that there is true self underneath there, which again is what you are. And when we have trauma, as what we see here, then you put on a mask to cover up that trauma, and that mask is a part of your ego, which is not your true self. It's something else. And those distinctions are very blurred. I mean, if we can't really define trauma without really thinking it through, how much more difficult it's to define a concept that we're not familiar with. So what I want you to, again, remember is that what your true self is, that's what trauma damages. That's trauma is the damage of your true self. When the damage occurs, we have masks. The trauma does not affect the mask. So the false self and the false front that we construct, we oftentimes hang on as, well, that's me. Oftentimes that's a misconception, but we'll get to that. So our main takeaways. So number one, emotional trauma is a form of damage to your true self. That's what we've covered here. That's what I want you to remember. And we often don't know the difference between the true self and the false self, which is our ego or our mask. So that's another thing I want you guys to remember as we go along, because that is going to be very important. We tend to get protective of those masks. And if we are, then we really can't heal the true self underneath. You remember that, all that blackness under that mask needs to be addressed, or we're not going to get anywhere. But as long as we're protective of the mask, then we can't deal with that effectively. So to properly heal trauma, we need to understand and accept our true self. So that's another thing that we're going to spend quite a bit of time on is like I said, right now it's probably all blurry and confusing, but that's what we're going to be talking about is understanding those concepts and seeing those differences. So in the next video, what we're going to be talking about is how and why trauma occurs. We're going to be talking about different kinds of trauma. So basically there's 6 childhood and 2 global traumas that tend to have the worst impact on us, and we're going to be talking about what they are. And now that we've defined all that and understood all that, why would we care? Because we're going to take steps to fix it and remove those obstacles from our path to success. We're not going to eliminate those things that wreck our lives, as we've put here, and so we are going to remove those hurdles and be successful and happy and live happily ever after. Let's put it this way. Okay, so that is the end of today's video. I'm going to stop the screen share and I'm going to stop the recording, and I'm going to see you guys in the next video. Where we are going to dig deeper. Thank you.